Hello everyone, welcome to today's live. Ryan Hassan here, joined by Matt Nettleton. Matt is not at his chair at the minute, but he will be in a minute or so. So I will introduce. We've got a few people saying hello. Nicole and Yvonne, hello. Thank you for joining us. The suspense is killing me. That's what the countdown timer is for, just to build that anticipation, Alyssa. Glad to be with you and very glad that you are joining us. Today we're going to be talking about some different techniques around processing emotions. I did a poll in the group the other day, just seeing what everyone wanted to hear about this week. And processing emotions had more than twice the next highest one. So it must be on a lot of people's minds out there. People are always after different techniques, whether you're watching and you're a practitioner or a practitioner in training, or you're on your own journey and you want to know. We're going to cover some different techniques today. Matt is back in his chair. Matt, how you going?
Good. I just need it. Sorry, my power's just come back on, so I'm just going to turn the TV off.
Yeah, no worries. Matt is having some work done. He's having some water tanks installed today, so he's had the power on and off there. But that is okay. So yeah, today we're going to talk about five different. We've got five techniques and a bonus one. So there's six. So we've got six different techniques around how we can start to process emotions. We're going to start off by laying a little bit of context around emotions. We need to sort of understand them and their nature, so to speak, and how they affect us as human beings. And then it'll make a much more sense as we go into the processing techniques around why they work, how they work, and it'll start to make a lot more sense that way. We've got a lot of comments so far. Alyssa says, I normally miss the lives. Well, I'm glad you're here. If you have any comments or questions along the way, please put them in the comments. I can see them right here. And we're happy to answer any questions along the way and at the end. So don't worry if you want to jump in and interrupt us with a question, please do that. If you're watching the replay later on, which a lot of people will be, being this in the middle of the day here in Australia, just put hashtag replay and let us know whatever questions or comments you have, and we will get back to you. Someone says, hi guys, hello. Great to see so many people on today. It's wonderful. So let's start off by setting a little bit of context around emotions. It helps if we can start to understand, what an emotion is and why we have them. So then we can start to move on to the context around why us human beings tend to store emotional imprints from the past and project emotional outcomes onto the future. And also then, how we can start to resolve those from the past and in the present. So if we think about what our emotions are in essence a biochemical expression that we tend to feel in the body. There's roots of it in the brain, but we tend to feel our emotions in the body. Think about when we feel fear or anxiety. It can be the chest, heart pounding a lot faster. It can be those butterflies in the stomach. We think about shame. The physiological response of shame is kind of this down to the right and this hunched over pose. When we think of sadness, we often feel that in the heart. Very, very physical kind of thing. So when we start to work with emotions, we do have to get down into our body. But if we talk about emotions being feedback, it's kind of good to think about this in evolutionary terms. Okay, there's a term that I love. It's called the true-line brain, and it's if we kind of break our brain up into three parts based on the evolution of life on this planet, we can start to understand the roots of emotions. So if we think about the first part of the true-line brain as the reptilian brain, we're talking about the cerebellum and the brainstem here. This is the most primitive part of our brain. When we're talking about that part of our brain and emotions, all that's located there is the most primal emotion that we have, and that's fear. Okay, the fear mechanism. If we think about reptiles, they haven't got the more complex emotions. They have fear and a fear response, which basically means move away from threat. That's what the fear response is for. Whether I do that by running with a flight response, whether I do that with a fight response of trying to fight back, or whether I do a fawn response and try and play dead. Sorry, Matt is just dropping out and coming back in. That we have this fear response, okay? And that is the reptilian part of our brain. As we move on then to the next part of our brain, the limbic brain or the mammalian brain, we can start to talk about some more complex emotions. Okay, mammals started to develop more complex emotions. They also started to work in groups. As we start to work in groups, we need more of these complex emotions in order to get feedback around our environment to know what we are moving towards and what we are moving away from. Okay, so think about some more complex emotions in that mammalian part of our brain. Then we move on to the prefrontal cortex, this part of our brain that us humans have at the front, the neocortex, of which the prefrontal cortex is part of. This part of our brain has seen humans do some amazing things. We've gone to the moon, we've built rockets, we've explored all these parts of the earth. It's done incredible things. It is also the part of us that is responsible for us dwelling in the past and projecting future outcomes and feeling depression and anxiety. So we're not just dealing with our emotions in the moment and what's happening right now, we're dealing with emotions of our past, and we're dealing with future anxieties of things that we think might happen. So, like anything that has a dualistic nature, there is a great benefit, but also a great cost. So, as human beings, we have the most complex set of emotions of all life. We have a lot to deal with, like I said, not just in the present, but in the past and the future. So it's really important to understand that as human beings, plus part of our, like mammals, part of our evolution has been the ability to work in groups. Okay, so Matt, is there anything you want to touch on that before we jump into emotional imprints and trauma?
Just as you were talking, like this, I remember this conversation I had with someone who studied a lot of Carl Jung, and I don't know whether this is sort of a Jungian theory, but this is what he said. He said, like hundreds of years ago, a lot of our emotional and unconscious symbols were projected outwards, like the forest over there belonged to the spirit of this, or like everything was magical and projected outwards. But once we explored everything, all our emotions and all our thoughts then became internalized, and because there was nowhere for that sort of those energetic sort of projections to go, so they became inward, because we knew everything out there. We thought we knew reality, so then our internal world became really, really chaotic at that point, and our emotions became really internalized. And like just I don't know if that relates, but it just reminded me of that a lot.
No, I agree. It's like, the lightning or fire would be a symbol of the gods are angry. Yeah, and that kind of thing. And then like we work out what it actually is. And then, it's like we can't externalize that or outsource it, as you spoke about. So that makes complete sense to me. So let's talk about emotional imprints from the past. When we're starting to talk about processing emotions, it's not so much, yes, we want to have these techniques to process emotions that come up on a day-to-day basis in the moment, but so many of the emotions that we experience are what myself and Matt will call echoes from the past. Okay, they're these emotional imprints that are stored within our soma, within our body, and then circumstances in our life today will trigger up that emotion into some sort of response. Okay, and so let's talk about maybe some of the tenets of what an emotional imprint is. I'll bring up a little graphic here. This is what myself and Matt would call trauma. Everyone has a different meaning for each word. You don't have to use the word trauma. You can use emotional imprint. The ancient Hindus would call it a samskara. There's many different kind of words for it, but we'll use the word trauma or emotional imprint here. So what happens as human beings? We have to remember that we are wired for survival. Okay, the survival of us and the survival of our species. We are not wired for peace and happiness. We have to take the reins for that. If we let our system run the show, then we're always going to be geared towards survival. So what happens when we go through a highly emotional event in our life, when we don't have a proper resource? And just remind me, Matt, to touch on resourcing before we get into the different processing techniques. We go through an intense emotional experience. There's no resource there. We don't have the capacity to properly process the emotion in the moment because we were never taught that, or we're really, really young, all of that kind of thing. Then what happens? What we would call a trauma would happen, which means our system goes into overwhelm. We're in a state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Basically, our nervous system becomes very dysregulated, and there's not a resource there to help us bring us back to regulation. This is when we can store emotional energy. So whether it's guilt, shame, anger, fear, sadness, hurt, or a combination of those, it will depending on whatever happened to the human being. That emotion, that energy doesn't find completion, okay? And it gets stored within us. Emotions are energy in motion, right? Emotion, they move, they're in constant fluctuation. Now, ideally, an emotion comes up, we get the feedback and we can let that emotion move through us. That's when a memory becomes wisdom, okay? And not an imprint or a trauma, when we learn from it and the energy moves through us. Us human beings not being able to taught that, you can imagine all these emotional imprints kind of circling on themselves in our body. And we've got a lot of these going on because a lot of us have been through different, instances in our life. So we have all these emotions stored within our body, ready to be triggered at a future date. And that's because the system wiring us for survival wants to alert us of something similar may be happening in the future so we can avoid that threat. It's kind of like we were chased by a saber-toothed tiger, thousands of years ago. But then from that day forward, I live my life looking around every bush and every corner for another saber-toothed tiger just because I don't want that to happen again. And that may never happen again in my life, but guess what? I've spent my life looking around every corner and every bush for that tiger that never presented itself because that imprint of the chase was stored within my system and never found completion. Okay, I hope all this is making sense so far. If we think about, Matt, do you want to maybe give the example, one we use in quite a few of our trainings and courses around the kid putting their hand up in class and kind of how this can play out in adult life years later?
Yeah. So, this isn't a given and it's not going to be everyone's experience. It depends on your childhood and how your nervous system has adapted. But say, it's definitely my experience. Say I'm at school and I don't understand what the teacher's saying. And so I put my hand up. And I ask a question, and then everyone laughs at my question because it's like way off what the teacher was talking about, or it was a bit stupid, or whatever. Everyone laughs. So I look at trauma as any time we contract within ourselves, or that's one way it can show up. We contract within ourselves, and we never find that completion. So I put my hand up, and everyone laughs, and everyone knows that feeling. It's kind of like what in polyvagal theory, like a dorsal vagal sort of shut down. I shut down into myself and keel over. It may not look physically, but internally, it's sort of like, oh. And then every time I go to put my hand up, from then on, I might get that same, no, don't do it. I'll contract, I'll recoil against the experience of putting my hand up and asking a question because it doesn't feel safe. So that what I would describe as a trauma. So from then on, every time I go to put my hand up, I won't do it. I'll get a big somatic no, like it's not safe. I'll be ridiculed, I'll be laughed at. An accumulation of that over time can end up as like social anxiety. It can end up as, really, really fearful in using my voice in lots of situations. Contract similar to resistance. Yeah, it can feel physically similar to resistance, but it's like a knot, you know what I mean? That sort of comes up anytime I go to speak, and we get this, everyone gets this, in different situations. I go to say something and it's like, no, don't say that, or it's out of fear that I'll be laughed at again. And if we have enough of those stored in our system, it's almost like our whole body can feel like just a contraction, and it can show up as chronic pain. It can show up as heaps of physical symptoms. The energy of that experience has imprinted itself and latched into my system, and it hasn't found a completion. It's like it starts the loop and gets stuck halfway, and then we carry it into the next situation, and then we live our lives based on these unconscious programs, incomplete survival loops. And it sort of shatters the concept of free will because they're just programs that are incomplete, playing themselves out over and over and over again. And we think we're making a decision. We think, oh yeah, it's me who's deciding to not put my hand up, but it's happening on a way, way deeper unconscious level. That decision's being made for us based on that experience. And that experience can look like putting my hand up in class, or it can look like, the most severe sexual abuse. But at the core of it, it's the same mechanism that's playing out.
Yeah, and I mean, that can show up, like if you think about the putting your hand up, if you think about emotions, there's kind of this fear and shame. Let's say they're the emotions that are attached. This fear of like, oh, I'm going to be outcast from the group. Then the shame of, yes, I am outcast from the group in that moment. And then all of a sudden we fast forward 20 years and then we go through the similar emotions. Let's say it's in a relationship, and let's say I'm not expressing my needs properly in a relationship, and I start reading about this stuff, and I'm like, oh, I just need to let my partner know these are my needs, and they'll respect that and all this kind of stuff. But the moment that I go, okay, I'm going to go speak to them, all of a sudden that fear starts to come up again. Yeah. And then we don't, and we rationalize and go, oh, no, they're really good and blah, blah. And then I go into that shame again. So it's the same emotional response that's happening 20 years prior. It's just happening with the adult in a different context now. And along with that, We've got the creation of deficiency stories here. So that's kind of the voice in their head or the belief that comes along with these emotions of it's not safe to speak up. I shouldn't speak up. You know, all of these beliefs that come along with it. And then we end up, when we have a lot of these imprints, we come up with a very dysregulated nervous system. So all of a sudden we can become shut down as a person, you know, or we can become hyper aroused in a sympathetic nervous system state as a person, just because we have so many of these incomplete loops and these undigested emotions going on within the system. Okay, and we would call this an orphaned part. It's like we have an orphaned part and it has all these qualities inside of it. At the core of it is these emotions that weren't able to be properly processed at the time. Okay, and this is why life presents us with so many problems. Well, there are also chances for growth, because, you know, we might have that issue in the relationship and go, the issue is with my relationship, without realizing it has its roots 20 years earlier in the inability to speak up because of the fear and shame. Okay, it's so much deeper on so many occasions.
So we relive our past over and over and over again, and our current relationship can very much be just a mirror of what our relationship was like with our parents. You know, the same unconscious loops that are playing out and the same patterns. And, you know, like I say, our partner is just our mum or our dad in different clothing. You know, they mirror those same childhood relational patterns, you know, those same trauma responses. And it's interesting that life does that, because it's looking for completion. You know, these energies are looking for completion, but the issue is we resist, and because we don't know how to be with these emotions, we don't know how to be with the sensations in the body, we don't know how to be with the experience and integrate it. You know, integration is just simply when the experience integrates itself and finds completion within the whole being. You know, we can intellectually understand, oh yeah, this is what I need to do, but that's just sort of from the neck up. It has to integrate through our whole nervous system, through our whole body. That's what I would say digesting an experience is. You know, digesting an emotion.
Yeah, it's really important what Matt said there around that these energies want completion. So what happens, we've unconsciously, based on our survival drive or our survival mechanism, we've unconsciously kept them in, kind of looping on themselves. So as we go into the different techniques now, you'll find, you know, some of the techniques sound a bit similar, but you'll find that the theme that runs through them is this whole idea of, let's see if we can get out of the way so they can start to complete. Let's see if we can create a better relationship with them. Like, we are in relationship to everything, not just other people. We're in relationship to ourselves. We're in relationship to every thought. We're in relationship to every emotion. As soon as we can create some distance and start to work with these energies and not be in opposition with them, we can start to see some really radical shifts. And that's what a lot of the themes are in these processing techniques. How do I, you know, someone in the comments used the word resistance. How do I stop resisting? You know, how do I first make conscious the fact that I was unconsciously resisting? Now that I know that I'm consciously resisting, how do I start to soften that resistance? And these emotions, they're different. I mean, we can soften an emotion, have it work through in a short time or in one session of working with someone. It can also take months. You know, some of them can take years. You know, we don't want to, you know, lie about that. Like, some of these things, impressions are big and they take a while to work through, but we can chip away at them. And it's really, really important that we do.
And just just quickly on resistance, you know, this is why it can't be done by thinking. You know, we have to actually meet the sensations in the body, because, you know, if I realize I'm resisting, oh, you know, like, oh no, like now it's not integrating, I'm resisting. And then I start resisting the fact that I'm resisting and trying to think my way out of it. And really, you know, at the core of it, it's about learning to become intimate with the felt sense, you know, learning to move in and feel the moment rather than try and think my way out of it and think, how am I going to stop resisting? Right. If there's resistance, how does that feel in the body? You might have a knot, you know, a lot of people experience it as like a knot in the belly. You know, shoulders might become tense. How do I meet that tension? You know, the direct experience of tension. How do I really feel it? Like, get inside it and experience it as tension rather than try and think my way out of it. Oh, I need a technique to stop resisting. All our techniques are just based on how I can actually experience the moment, you know, and how I'm present with it.
And this is where the mind starts to get confused. Okay, this is where the mind will start to go, no, give me a clearer technique, because what we're doing, what Matt's saying, is we're realizing I've got resistance, someone commented, haha, I'm good at resisting. And then what we do, we resist the resistance. So now if I'm resisting resistance, I'm going to get more resistance. And it's like I'm just in a loop there. So it's like, how can I actually step completely out of resistance? So we'll start to touch on the processing techniques now, and just let us know what questions come up as we kind of go through these. So the first one, number 1, pendulation and cohabitation. I'll quickly touch on the topic of resourcing here because it's relevant for this particular technique. Pendulation and cohabitation works really well when we have a very intense emotional imprint, one that we find as soon as we touch on it or start to go into, we get overwhelmed really quickly. Okay, this is very different for different people. It would depend on people's emotional sensitivity, what the actual imprint is. But for a lot of people, when we start to jump in and touch on an emotion, an old imprint, it just gets overwhelming really fast. And then we don't really get anywhere, because if I stick myself in overwhelm and try and stay there, I'm just creating more of a dysregulated nervous system. Okay,
It's like being in a car in neutral and having your foot full ball on the accelerator, not going anywhere.
Why am I not going anywhere? So pendulating means I'm oscillating or pendulating between two different spots. I'm going from one to the other. Okay, so I'll quickly touch on resourcing here, because one of those points is the emotional disturbance. The guilt, the shame, the anger, the fear, the sadness, the hurt, whatever it is, it's over here. And when we touch on that for a certain period of time, it gets very overwhelming and we end up revving the car. The point that we pendulate to is we want to find some sort of sense of safety, support, neutrality in our system. And if we don't have that in our system, that can be cultivated through practicing resourcing. We've got other videos on resourcing, probably in the guides of this group, I imagine there'll be a couple. So we won't dive into how we actually build a good resource and cultivate that, because we have other videos on it. But basically, the imprint is threat. Okay, it's fear, and then whatever other emotions are associated with fear that branch out from that. The opposite of threat is safety. Okay, so we want to pendulate from the opposite. You know, Stephen Paul just uses the word safety is healing, and this is kind of how we can use it in that context. So what we can do, we can touch on an emotional disturbance, and then as soon as we start to find ourselves dipping into an overwhelmed state, we can come back to our resource of safety. Okay, now we can do that through different areas of the body. We can do that through a memory, a person, a place, or an imagined place. There's different ways to do that. But we can pendulate back to that sense of safety, which can bring us out of overwhelm until we're ready to go back and touch on the disturbance again. Okay, and we can pendulate between those two, and we might pendulate 3 times, and all of a sudden we can feel a bit more comfortable and able to house this particular disturbance. Maybe we have to pendulate 100 times, right? What we don't know until we start to try it. But what we're doing is we're just oscillating between those 2 points. I think Matt uses the example of kind of turning the tap on and off on a tap. Do you want to maybe expand on that, Matt?
Yeah. And if you're doing this yourself, it could look like laying down and feeling your body, feeling what's happening in the body. And we're talking about resistance, feeling the resistance, exploring what it feels like to resist. And it's like, okay, that's enough. I'm going to go outside and go for a walk through my garden for 10 minutes. That counts as pendulating back to a resource. And then you come back and you do it again. And as we do that, we're growing in our capacity and to feel, to actually inhabit our bodies and inhabit what it means to be human. And, so if I turn the tap on a little bit and it starts dripping, I see so many different trauma therapies. It's like, just turn the tap on full ball, breathe through it, and then turn the tap off, and that counts as trauma work. But that doesn't help a person learn to contain these emotions. That doesn't help a person grow in their capacity to experience sensation, and it doesn't integrate 99% of the time. It's just like being in the car with the foot on the accelerator on neutral. But so what we do is we turn the tap on. We might feel it a little bit. We might feel these emotions that start coming up, and then we turn the tap off. Count as going out to the garden or coming back to our resource. Yeah, like acclimatizing a new fish to a fish tank. That's exactly right. And then we turn it on a bit more, and this time we might put the pressure on a little bit more. And so the tap starts dripping a bit with a bit more force. And then eventually we can turn the tap on full ball without tipping into full-blown overwhelm and shock and re-traumatizing ourselves. Because if we don't develop that capacity, and we just turn it on full ball, it's like throwing a fish into a new tank without acclimatizing it. There's no, it can re-traumatize our system. So, It's like bit by bit by bit by bit. It's a good word for it. We're acclimatizing, and growing in our capacity to experience these unconscious dormant energies. And if we have a capacity to experience it, then it integrates itself. I've had some people ask me, how do I actually integrate? Well, it actually integrates itself when you're able to stay present with it, which is something we develop.
Yeah, someone has commented on the video on resourcing. What I'll do after we jump off, I'll put it in the comments. We'll have a few around. If it's not in this group, we'll have ones on YouTube. So I will put it in the comments once we jump off. So what does I suppose progress look like in this instance? It's like, hey, this particular imprint I could only spend like 5 seconds with before going into complete overwhelm. Then after doing this practice for however long, all of a sudden, hey, I can now spend 5 minutes with this disturbance without going into overwhelm. I can spend 10 minutes, right? So that's real progress of us being able to remain more present with a really strong disturbance in the system. And then the other word there is cohabitation. Once we do this pendulating enough, we can actually get to a place, instead of pendulating between 2 points, we can actually hold both of those points within our experience. Okay, this can take quite a lot of practice. Okay, but it's really wonderful when we get there, because all of a sudden we can be really well resourced. We can have a nice capacity, feeling strong within ourselves, and also have an emotional disturbance present. But it's kind of that disturbance is held within that resourced whole. Now, the beauty of being able to cultivate that is that when we meet the day-to-day challenges, we won't drown in the waters, so to speak. We can swim. Okay, so let's say something happens at work with a coworker or my boss or something. Instead of me going into overwhelm and being unresourced, that can come into my system and be cohabited with this really resourced state. So we're so much better able to handle and digest life's experiences once we're able to do that. But it does come down to the practice and also building a resource. Yeah. All right, let's go number 2. Dimmer switch. We were talking about, turning the tap on not being a great thing. It can be a good thing in some instances. Okay. Dimmer switch is a wonderful one. I actually use dimmer switch a hell of a lot in my therapy sessions and have over the years. So basically when we're talking about dimmer switch, I spoke about earlier, we are creating a relationship with these emotions. Okay. As soon as the emotions overtake me and I'm drowning in them, I'm not in relationship to them. They are me. I'm completely enmeshed. Okay. As soon as we can start to see not as us being sad or us being angry, it's being we're experiencing sadness or anger, we can now be in a relationship. We've created some space. If you think about the kind of 3 things that we experience in life, is we experience the outside world, what comes in through our senses. We experience thoughts, this thing that doesn't shut up here. And we experience these emotions generally in the body. That's all we experience. We understand that the things that come in through our senses, we've got some distance between. I don't look at Matt and go, that's me, unless I'm in my, unified God state. But normally I don't. I don't look at my table and chairs out here and go, oh, that's me. I'm like, I can see Orion's here and that's there. With our thoughts and emotions, because they are so much closer, because they're in here somewhere, or that's where they feel like they are, we lose that sense of space and that sense of a relationship with that. Okay, and then we start to really identify with these emotions and states, which can help us, which doesn't help us, actually work through them and let them go, because now they're part of our identity. So anyway, we're in relationship with the emotion. We can start to get to know it. Let's say it's sadness. We can start to go, okay, where is this sadness that I'm experiencing being held in my body? And I'm like, it's just this sinking feeling in my chest and my stomach. It may have a color. It may be gray. It may be black. It may be red. We can start to say, well, how intense might that energy feel at the minute? If 10's being the most and 0's the least, and I'm like, it could be an 8 out of 10 in intensity. With the dimmer switch, we can then start to play with the intensity of that emotion once we're in relationship with it. We can experience, if it's an 8, what would it be like turning it up to a 10? If it's a 4, what would it be like turning it up to an 8? And what we can do, we can start to actually play with intensifying or dimming down the intensity of these particular energies in the body, which creates a wonderful relationship with it. And we can start to realize, oh my God, I can make this more intense or less intense. When I do make it more intense, I'm actually okay. I thought with that 9 out of 10 that it was before, I could not handle any more, but I actually can. Okay, so it really helps develop a great relationship within the body, and oftentimes it can get these energies moving when we start to intentionally, if we're well resourced, if we intentionally start to intensify, all of a sudden we can start to get some of this energy moving. I've had a lot of clients who, if the emotion or the energy is located in one spot, let's say the chest, by doing this, all of a sudden the whole body might be starting to tingle and start to feel it, which is a great sign that we're starting to get some of this emotional energy moving. Anything to add there, Matt?
It's just like playing with the tap, you know. So I realize my threshold, my window of tolerance, and I can stop there. Then I can turn it down a bit more, and my window of tolerance starts to grow. So the more I turn up the dimmer switch, or the more I pendulate, you know, and we can use the dimmer switch to titrate and pendulate. You know, it's like, say I've got fear. What would it be like to turn the dial up on that fear? And as soon as we feel like, oh yeah, that's my level, window of tolerance, that's my threshold right there. Maybe take a breath or use whatever other technique might work for you, and then we can turn it back down, and then go out to the garden and then do it again, turn it up and down, you know. And it helps people regain a sense of control over their experience, because when we fall into overwhelm, you know, it's a universal symptom to feel out of control. You know, so things like this can help regain that sense of control over my emotions, over my body.
It can also be a good one as well for actually getting some expression. Like, we've been kind of conditioned as a culture to not show our emotions for one, but secondly, don't cry. That's being seen as weak. We have all these ideas and everything, and I've worked with so many people who have this deep sadness or grief, or there's something going on, and they're stuck in it, but they're not actually expressing it. Like, the tears aren't flowing when they actually need to in a lot of instances. And so I found with this, even by able to turning up the intensity and everything, all of a sudden I can actually get people to start actually crying, which is quite often what they need in that moment. Yeah, which is that the energy starting to release and come out, because it's like we're always trying to keep a lid on something, and sometimes we actually need to let that lid off, and so we can realize that, hey, what comes out is actually okay. And it's often beautiful in many instances. So there's the dimmer switch. Third one, merging and distancing. Okay, so merging and distancing, it might sound a little bit like pendulation, but it does have some differences. Matt, do you want to jump in and have a bit of a chat about merging?
Yeah, it relates back to what you were talking about, where it's like I become the emotion, and I don't mean it in that sort of unified, non-dual state of was like I am the experience, but more like I'm completely identified with the experience. And say I'm in a state of overwhelm, like you were saying, there's no space. I'm completely hijacked by this shutdown, or this fear, or this activation, or whatever it is that we're experiencing. Distancing can be like stepping back and learning to witness it, getting that space. So it's like I might look down at my body and explore the sensation or the emotion from a place of being a witness. So say I've got sadness in my belly, I can sort of witness it. I can get some distance from it. And, there's nothing better to do than sensations. And we can actually use little sort of techniques and play with it. Like, I can look at my hands, look at it objectively, and then I can look down at the emotion. So I've stepped back, taken a step back. Merging is then stepping back in consciously. And the word to really, reiterate there is consciously. Because when I'm completely identified and lost in it, like I'm drowning in it, I'm not consciously experiencing it. So if I step back in and say merge with the energy, I step right into my body, almost like I get under the skin of my body. I step right in, like fully embody this. This can be hard to do. It can take a lot of practice. But I step right into my body. I almost merge with it. Not in the same way of drowning in it, but I consciously merge with it. And then I can feel it start to moving, up my spine, down my legs, and the energy starts to flow and move. And then, I reach that threshold again of the tap. I step back out and I can witness it again. And all of this can take a lot of practice. If you've never done anything like this, these sort of things can sound really, really complex, But if you do it in a session with someone guiding you, it will be much, much easier.
Yeah, because there's a subtlety to it,
Yeah.
with there's nuance. And so what merging can look like, or what it can look like when it's really effective, is being able to step into the emotion and experience that emotion without any story. It's like anger's a great one if you can get good at kind of merging with anger, because anger's always got a story. I'm angry at. I'm either angry at a person or a situation, or myself, right? But if we can completely let that story drop away and just experience the archetypal energy of anger, it can be an amazing experience, because anger, and Matt speaks about this a lot in our courses, it's our power. And as soon as you can experience anger without all the stories attached to it, because when the stories are attached, it becomes this aggression. It's an unhealthy expression of anger. But if we experience anger without the story, it is like our power. We feel powerful. We can go from powerless to empowered. We can feel the anger that every human being that has ever lived has gone through at some point, something that we all experience in some form or another. And then we can come out of that merging as if we're jumping out of the water and just standing on the beach and looking back at it and going, whoa, that's intense.
Yeah, fully feeling anger can be very empowering. Empowerment is the medicine for rage, because it's no longer rage, it's empowered energy. And this comes with feeling the energy of it. I would recommend, finding a EP practitioner and doing this with in a one-on-one session as well, if this is something you're struggling with.
Yeah. Try these things yourself. But then obviously, if you're like, I'm struggling with this, am I doing this right? Or, I'm keep going into overwhelm, or I can't access something, then it's always good to have a guide to lead you into those waters, because then you'll be able to navigate yourself at some point in the future. So that's merging and distancing. Another thing we can do to bring some more emotions and information up to our consciousness is some belief investigation. Like we spoke about with an orphaned part and the different qualities that orphaned part has. It's the nervous system state, the threat response, the emotional energy, and also the deficiency stories or beliefs that come along with that. And so as we start to create a relationship with whatever emotion we're holding in our body, and like I spoke about earlier with dimmer switch, when we're finding out its qualities, where it sits, the density of it, the color of it, the intensity out of 10, we can start to then create a dialogue with that part. Okay, and it's really beautiful, right? We can actually create a dialogue. We can actually start to ask that part, let's say it's sadness, and ask that sadness, what do you believe? What's your story? What do you believe about the world or about yourself? And we can start to have some really strong things come through. We can start to hear like, I'm never going to feel safe. Everybody's always out to get me. Everybody that I get close to is going to hurt me. Okay, we can start to understand the story that's encapsulated within that emotion. And this information is so valuable, because so many of the patterns that we have in our life come from our belief systems. Our belief systems are the filter that we view reality through. We've all got our own individual set of beliefs. That's why we're all a bit different. That's why different human beings react to different situations differently, right? That's why one thing could be a trauma and one mightn't be a trauma. That's why, someone watching me and Matt talk today could be like, these guys are talking crap, they're both idiots. Or they can go, wow, this is incredible, they're amazing. No one's right. We're just landing a bit nicer through their belief systems, right? This is why you can't take anything personally, right? It's hard not to, but this is why you can't. So what we can do is when we open up this dialogue with this emotion, we can start to unpack, hey, wow, okay, this is what it believes about itself. Because once we understand our really some core unconscious beliefs that we have about ourselves and the world, a lot of the patterns in our life will start to make sense. If I have a belief that women can't be trusted, then I'm not going to have a very good relationship track record, okay? Because the belief wants to perpetuate itself. Yeah. If I believe women can't be trusted, I will start to get into relationships with women that can't be trusted, because the belief wants to sustain itself. If I believe that the world is very, very unsafe and there's always threat, that's what I will perceive. Okay. That's how I filter my reality. So we can open up a dialogue and start to talk with this part. We can have this investigation. Anything you want to add there, Matt?
No, I think you covered most of it.
Great. Nicole just said, my anger was so deeply hidden, so freeing, releasing it safely. Amazing. I love hearing that. Nicole, one of our students, an OG really, from the... Great. We're going to get to anger, actually. Our bonus one, number 6, is actually to do with anger, because we had a few questions with that. But we'll quickly touch on number 5, which is actually quite a basic one. which is some rhythmic breathing. So like we said, we can start to work with the breath and work with our physiology as certain energies and emotions come up in the body. Matt, do you want to talk about rhythmic breathing and how we can incorporate that? And just before you do, like obviously, rhythmic breathing can be combined with any of the four that we've mentioned previously as well. We can blend these.
Yeah, and like rhythmic breathing is one that like you can really practice doing on your own and get the hang of it all through the day. In any kind of situation or experience, and like if anyone who's watching, you can practice it as I'm talking. So all we do is breathe into the sensation and breathe it out, almost like we're giving it back to the space around us. And so first, let's just like explore what's happening in our body. Notice even physical pains, because physical pains can be just contracted energy showing up as physical pain. So just take a moment to just explore, come down, sink into the body, into now. Just beginning to feel the sensations in the body. It's just really basic. So, like might be a knot in the belly or a pain in the back or in the legs. There might be some densities, or it might be quite pleasant even. Just notice the body and what's happening in the body. So this is the dimension we work with, the felt sense, feeling the body. It's not about trying to come to any conclusion or answer or figure anything out or understand anything even. It's just feeling the body, whatever's happening. We don't need to try and change what's happening, just feel it for a moment. And just taking a deep breath in. And then breathe it out into the space around. You can sort of get a rhythm going. And instantly I feel my body start to come alive. Any sort of contracted or stagnant energies I feel start moving. And it's like almost like everything around me starts shimmering. My body starts to feel like it's aliveness, it's essence. And that's when things start moving. That's the energy in motion again. Just so something as simple as that. But the key is to do it with the felt sense.
And so it's really good, I think, you've spoken about, relating it to physical pain as well. I think that's if it's a bit foreign with the relationship to our emotions, you can just try it with physical stuff first, right? So like I said, we're in relationship to everything. So if I start doing that exercise and I'm like, okay, I can feel a little bit of pain in my back. I've had this back pain. Then we can start to work out what's my relationship to that on my lower back on the right. What's my relationship to it? It sucks. I wish I didn't have back pain. I want it to go away. Okay. I'm in a really dysfunctional relationship with that part of myself. Okay. It's not a good place for me to actually work with that pain, understand the root cause behind it, start to work with it, not hate it, start to love it. We can do that with our emotions as well. Because most people, I feel this anxiety. Fuck, I want it to go away. Why does this always happen now? Right? I'm in an adversarial relationship with myself. I'm just fighting myself. This is how fear. So fear is an emotion, anxiety is a state. When I have this emotion over and over again that I don't properly deal with and work with, it becomes a state, which we call anxiety. It's like we got anxiety because we were fighting with ourselves. Okay, and then we keep doing it when it's the anxiety. Okay, so we've got to create this much more functional and compassionate relationship with these parts of ourselves. You can start with the physical stuff if you want, then work onto the emotional stuff or jump right into the emotional stuff. Because a lot of what we're talking about with these techniques is I'm turning towards with compassion instead of turning away from with resentment. Because that's all, and it's not our fault. We were conditioned that way. We always got in trouble when we were having tantrums or when we were sad. We were distracted to try and make us feel better. We were never accepted for being in those states. Neither were our parents. That's why they couldn't do it. It's no one's fault. We were then rewarded when we were in good states, when we were good boys and girls, So we've got an aversion to these uncomfortable or negative states and a desire for the constant need for these positive states or pleasurable states. And we have to start to break that conditioning if we want to be free. All right, let's go to the bonus one. Anger and grief. We had a few questions when I posted we're going to talk about processing emotions around anger. The students that, or a lot of the sessions that me and Matt have done over the years, but especially we've seen as well in our students over the last couple of years, is that there's such a level of suppressed anger within our society. It is such a frowned upon emotion. Very much so in the female population. We've got these ideas that, it's an ugly emotion, women shouldn't show anger or rage and that kind of thing. And what it is seen as a real epidemic of suppressed anger and rage. Okay. So we want to maybe talk a little bit, because anger, if we think about a lot of the emotions like, sadness and guilt and apathy, they're like this downward emotion, like it's a shut down kind of emotion. Okay. When we think about the emotion of anger, we spoke about before, if you merge with it without the story, it is power. It's a very sympathetic or uplifting or uprising emotion. It's very active. So sometimes we need to get a little bit more active in order to start to get that anger moving and create a relationship with it. Matt, do you want to talk about some of the things that we can do to get the anger moving?
Yeah, and we a lot of us habitually go to shut down or to freeze to avoid, not consciously, but just the way we've been conditioned to avoid experiencing anger. Because when anger's integrated, it's like I'm upright, I'm here, I'm a force to be reckoned with, I'm a presence. I can channel my anger to create social change and towards injustice, and, making positive changes in the world. That integrated and contained anger can really, really be channeled and be a positive force. Because like we said, it is power. It's what makes our no mean no. It's what makes us stand up for what's right. All those sort of things. But when it's shut down, it's like we recoil at, injustice, rather than doing something about it, because we don't feel safe to stand in our own true shoes. And, our relationship to anger as a culture it can be so dysfunctional. And, it can start as when we're kids, where it's sort of like, well, I don't want to go to school today. I'm angry about the fact that I have to, and that is not acknowledged at all, and I'm dragged off in the car and taken to school. And so then my anger gets suppressed in that situation. It happens over and over and over again. And, the more that my relationship to anger becomes one of resistance, then the more my power is shut down, the less I feel safe to be me, in a sense, to have autonomy, to be self-governing. And, like to get anger moving, it requires us to sort of come out of a shutdown response, and we use the metaphor of the tap again. We turn it on bit by bit by bit by bit. We experience little bits of anger until we can fully embody the energy of rage, and that reminds me of, like, my mind gives like archetypical images of like a silverback gorilla or Jesus flipping the change tables at the church, just like holy rage, outrage. And when I fully contain it, and I'm talking about, stepping into it without getting overwhelmed, it's like I get images as well of like tornadoes or tsunamis, like a natural force, like a force of nature, like a force to be reckoned with. It could do so much damage and harm, and that's really what we're afraid of. But when it's fully contained, it can be channeled and directed and create positive change. But, if we're in a shutdown response, I'll use an example of one client. Like we would go into sort of activation, and his pattern was to go into shutdown the moment he would start experiencing anger, because his mum would crack it at him as a kid every time he would go into anger. Don't do that. And so then he'd habitually go into shutdown to avoid feeling the anger. And we'd go into anger, and then he'd say, "Oh, it feels like my dick just went limp." That was the words he used. But it is like that. We can go into this space of feeling the rage, and then shut down, the habitual shutdown. And so it is about slowly training our nervous system that it's okay to feel anger. Doing it in a safe space, having a client therapist relationship, or learning to do it by yourself, or things like that. Starting to bring about a sympathetic charge, more sympathetic activation. So we could go for a run and do it while we're running. We can make noises like really feel the growl there, the power of that. We can start clenching our fists, just little things like that. start to feel take more activated breaths. And if we go into shutdown, that's okay. Don't allow the sort of inner critic to start saying, "Oh, you screwed up. You've gone into shutdown."
We notice.
Yeah, just notice. Just acknowledge. Oh yeah, I've gone into.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That's meant to shut down.
Yeah, just acknowledge it. So we're starting to, get the blueprint of what our inner survival patterns are like, and then we practice it again. We can come back. So it's like turning the tap on more and more and more until we can turn the tap on full ball and experience it, like the essence of what it's like to rage without tipping into overwhelm. And it is the fear of violence, or the fear of hurting someone, or the fear of love being withdrawn, or the fear of, breaking up my relationship, or it's the fear of the potential of what the expression of this energy can create. It could kill someone. Some of these dormant energies in our, collective unconscious, like associated with rage, like they, could destroy cities if they were be allowed to let loose. But so this is about slowly learning to contain them as they arise, in each moment. And this is something, we're never going to get perfect, and it's something we do for the rest of our lives. Learn to contain these sort of energies. And working with anger or my rage has been so transformative. Like it really, really has.
You go.
I was just to say, I was so shut down, to the point, like, because my life, like, anger really, really meant violence, in the world I was in prison systems and all of that sort of stuff. If I showed anger, there were a lot more dangerous people than me that were a lot more willing to hurt me. So my relationship to anger was completely freeze or shut it down. And I got to a point, if I saw someone being treated badly that I care about, I wouldn't say anything because it wasn't safe to. And then that became a habitual pattern. But really allowing myself to experience anger, it's like now my no means no.
I love that. And that's one of the things Nicole just said, fear of losing control. And yeah, that's a big one. We have this fear of, what will this energy do? But on the flip side of that, I spoke about an epidemic of this suppressed anger. And when we have suppressed anger, like Matt said about saying no, we don't say no, we don't set boundaries, we don't have an ability to because we get shut down. The result of that is we start to resent everything in our life. Yeah. We resent our partner, we resent our work, we resent our friends, we resent our kids, all of this stuff because we haven't properly integrated our anger, and we don't want a life of resentment for anyone, because that's a horrible life. Resentment that I've heard are called soul suicide, being in a state of resentment, and that's a result of suppressed anger.
It's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
To get sick, yeah. Yeah, I've heard that one, it's good.
It's and it is a big thing, this, because if my no starts to mean no and I get angry, it might potentially mean the end of my relationship. It might potentially mean the relationship to my mother drastically changes, or my father, or my partner, because we're in these patterns where they feel safe and, or we're comfortable, let's use the word comfortable, where they feel comfortable and I feel comfortable, maybe me fawning and them being the perpetrator, and then switching roles, so those patterns are familiar. But if I start to really stand firm, no means no, they might walk away.
Changes the dynamic in the relationship, right?
Completely. And so, all these sort of things can...
Well, it comes back to attachment, doesn't it? It's like, well, now if I decide to integrate anger and have a no, then all of a sudden my attachments might be threatened. So I will continue to live a life of resentment and fawning.
Yeah, exactly. So our lives can drastically change, and if I completely transform this, and so like there can be huge, let's use the word, consequences, from really integrating my anger. I could completely drastically change my life to the point that I actually don't want to do that.
Yeah. Or your partner might love it and it might be healthy for the relationship, but you won't find out because you assume that it's going to be negative.
Yeah, you don't know, and it's the unknown, that can cause a lot of resistance to it. If I fully feel this, or I'm happy to feel it in session, but I'm not taking that out into my everyday life, or.
Mm-hmm. To give you an idea of what it looks like, me and Matt did a bit of a session a couple of weeks back where we were essentially, it was a merging with anger kind of deal. And sort of Matt was guiding me through it and, letting go of the story, but just experiencing anger. And we were on Zoom, in our rooms. but we were up and about. You know, we were pacing around the room. We were growling. I was yelling. And like Matt said, he has this archetype of like a silverback gorilla. I was getting this archetype of like a Maori warrior with all the, you know, the face paint and everything. And like I was pounding my chest. And it's like just experiencing anger for what it is, this incredibly powerful force. That doesn't mean I'm going to go walk down the street, you know, with my face painted, picking fights with people. It just means that if I integrate that part, I'm better able to set a boundary and say no to my partner or someone else when I need to, right? And then the reason I put on I suppose the title, anger and grief, is that when you really experience it without the story, and Matt did this really beautifully. We were going for maybe 20 minutes, just anger, yelling, growling, you know, pacing around, all of that kind of stuff. And Matt took me through a thing where we'd literally hold our hand outstretched and just say no from that place of anger, no. And then that's great as well, because we can also notice if I find that uncomfortable, or maybe my no is a bit like a mouse saying no, no. And we notice that it's foreign. Yeah, we don't judge it. We just notice. And then what you can find when you really start to embody anger without these stories, then you can start to touch on the grief that's underneath the anger. It's trying to protect something. That's what anger's doing. It's trying to protect another part of us. And oftentimes, if we really get into the merging, then we can touch on the grief underneath, which is really the grief of being a human being at the end of the day. The vulnerability of being a human. Yeah, I can experience love and connection and all these things, but I can also experience great pain and suffering, and that's part of being human as well. And we can start to properly grieve that human experience that is underneath the anger, and that can be a really powerful experience.
A lot of the time, you know, grief is under anger, you know, and so we can go through these cycles of emotions. You know, and to me, like this whole journey, you know, and a lot of people have this orientation. It's about feeling better. You know, I want to feel better, and that's okay. You know, that has its place. But for me, and what I sort of teach, and the way I orient is around experiencing what it's like to be human. You know, all of these sort of things: anger, grief, sadness, frustration, fear. You know, happiness, joy, love, bliss, all of those sort of things. Like experiencing our humanity means to experience the full spectrum of human emotions. You know, not to prefer and try to get to a place where we only experience this. It's like being partially human. You know, it's like you know, my son, you know, gets really, really sick and has to go to hospital, and I'm just in a state of bliss and happiness. It's like, you know, no, feel the grief and feel what it's like to be human.
Speaking of kids.
Yeah, hey, Tommy.
No, Scorpius Rex. Do you want to say hi to everyone? Hi. All right, thank you everyone for joining us. I think we'll wrap it up there. If you have any questions, post them in the comments below. If you are watching the replay, just put #replay. Any comments or questions, we will answer them. We hope you have learned something around some processing techniques around emotions today that you can incorporate into your life. Much love, and Matt, thanks for joining me as always.
Thanks.
Say bye. Everyone say bye.